Maya pulled the red dress off the rack, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it against herself. The fabric felt smooth under her touch, and for the first time in a long time, she could picture it, walking into the gala, the soft shimmer of the dress catching the light, the way people might actually look at her and not through her. It was a feeling she didn't get often, the possibility of belonging, of being seen not as someone to be pitied, but as someone who was simply there, like everyone else. But just as the warmth of that thought settled in, a sharp, hushed voice cut through the moment. "Oh my God, is she actually serious?" Maya's shoulders tensed instantly, the kind of reaction that came from years of knowing exactly when a conversation was about her, even when people pretended it wasn't. "This isn't a joke, right?" She turned her head slightly, just enough to confirm what she already knew. Jessica and Olivia, two girls from her college who always seemed to orbit wherever she was, not because they liked her, but because making sure she knew she wasn't welcome was their favorite pastime. They stood near the shoe section, both holding overpriced heels in their hands, but their eyes were locked on her, exchanging glances, smirking in a way that made Maya's stomach twist. "That dress is the last one in stock," Olivia whispered, nudging Jessica. "And she actually thinks she's going to wear it to the gala." Jessica let out a soft, fake laugh, the kind that was meant to sound like amusement but was laced with cruelty. "That's just, wow. I almost feel bad for her." "Almost." Maya swallowed, her grip tightening on the dress as she forced herself to focus on anything other than the way her face was burning. She had two choices. She could pretend she didn't hear them, walk away, take the dress into the fitting room, and hope that somehow ignoring them would make the humiliation fade faster. Or she could turn around and say something, force them to acknowledge that she wasn't deaf to their whispers, that she wasn't some nameless shadow in the background of their perfect little world. For once, she chose the second option. And what exactly is so funny? Her voice came out steadier than she expected, but the way Jessica and Olivia's expressions flickered made her heart hammer harder. Jessica blinked, momentarily thrown off, before tilting her head in mock surprise. "Oh, Maya, sweetie, we weren't laughing at you." Olivia snorted under her breath, not even trying to hide it. "I mean, not exactly." Maya exhaled slowly, the dress still clutched tightly in her hands. "I don't really care what you meant," she said, her tone firm, even as her pulse pounded. "But if you have something to say it to my face." Jessica's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Fine, since you're asking. That dress? It's not for you." Maya's breath caught for half a second, but she didn't let her expression falter. "And why not?" Olivia crossed her arms, shifting her weight onto one leg. "Maya, come on. You know why." Jessica leaned in slightly, her voice dropping into that same tone she used whenever she wanted to sound like she was doing someone a favor. "Look, you don't belong at the gala. It's not a charity event. It's for people who actually fit in, who know how to carry themselves, who don't." She paused, giving Maya a once-over, her eyes dragging down to the dress in her hands. "Who don't try too hard to be something they're not." Maya felt the sting deep in her chest, the kind that didn't just come from words, but from the way they were spoken, the way they were meant to cut. It wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. But today, for some reason, it hit differently. She could already hear her mother's voice in her head, the same thing she always told her when she came home with red-rimmed eyes from people like Jessica and Olivia. "They don't matter. They don't define you. You're stronger than this." But standing there, in the middle of that boutique, under the weight of two pairs of judging eyes, she didn't feel strong. She felt like a girl holding a dress she suddenly wasn't sure she had the right to wear. Jessica smirked as if she could see it, the doubt creeping in. She reached forward and flicked the price tag, her manicured nail tapping against it with a soft click. "Come on, Maya. Be honest with yourself. Do you really think you're walking out of this store with that dress? Is there a problem here?" The voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make every muscle in Maya's body freeze. It was calm, steady, and yet it carried something beneath it, an authority that made Jessica and Olivia's heads snap up, their smugness vanishing in an instant. Maya turned, and standing there, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on the scene before him, was Jackie Chan. For a moment, no one moved. The air in the boutique felt heavier, charged with something unspoken yet undeniable. Jessica and Olivia stood frozen, their confident smirks wiped clean, replaced with something hesitant, something almost nervous. Jackie Chan didn't need to raise his voice or step forward to take control of the room. He just existed in that space differently than anyone else, and somehow, that was enough to shift everything. His eyes weren't on them, though. They were on Maya, scanning her face with quiet attentiveness, as if trying to read the invisible weight she carried. Jessica was the first to recover, though it was clear she was struggling to regain her footing. She forced out a small laugh, tilting her head slightly, her lips pulling into something that was meant to be casual but instead looked strained. "Oh well, I didn't realize," she stopped mid-sentence, clearly aware that whatever she had been about to say wasn't going to land the way she wanted it to. She glanced at Olivia, who was gripping her purse strap a little too tightly, then back at Maya, as if searching for a way to twist the situation in her favor. Maya didn't speak. She couldn't. The overwhelming contrast between the moment before and the moment now left her breathless. Just seconds ago, she had been on the verge of folding in on herself, letting their words sink into her skin like they always did, making her question everything: her place at the gala, the way she looked, whether or not she even deserved to wear something beautiful. And now, Jackie Chan was standing between her and them, not with his body, not with grand gestures, but just with his presence. When Jessica didn't continue, Jackie finally spoke, his voice still calm, still even. "I asked if there was a problem here." Jessica let out another awkward laugh, her hand flicking up to adjust the perfectly straight strands of her hair, a nervous habit she probably wasn't even aware of. "Oh, no, of course not," she said quickly, her voice lighter now, almost performative. "Maya's a classmate of ours. We were just talking, right?" She turned toward Maya expectantly, waiting for confirmation, waiting for her to smooth everything over like people like her always expected people like Maya to do. Maya still didn't speak. Jackie's gaze didn't waver as he looked at Jessica and Olivia, his expression unreadable. If Maya had to describe it, it wasn't anger, it wasn't even disappointment, it was just stillness, the kind that made people uncomfortable because it gave them nowhere to hide. Olivia finally cleared her throat, shifting on her feet, the silence becoming unbearable for her. "It was just a misunderstanding," she mumbled, though her usual arrogance was noticeably absent. "We didn't mean anything by it." Jackie let out a quiet breath, slow and measured, before finally addressing Maya. "Do you want the dress?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it took her a second to process it. She looked down at the fabric still clutched in her hands, the dress she had been so sure about before their voices had filled the space around her, stripping away that certainty piece by piece. She had been holding on to the idea of that gala for weeks, imagining how it would feel to be there, to blend into the elegance of it all, but now she wasn't sure. Because even if she showed up wearing this dress, people like Jessica and Olivia would still be there, watching, whispering, waiting for her to make a mistake. She swallowed hard, her grip on the fabric tightening. Jackie spoke before she could finish. "Do you want it?" Maya exhaled sharply, the question settling into her chest in a way she hadn't expected. He wasn't asking whether she thought she should have it, whether she thought she deserved it, whether she thought she could pull it off. He was just asking if she wanted it. And that was something no one had ever really asked her before, at least not without some kind of caveat, some kind of expectation that she measure her desires against what the world was willing to give her. She lifted her chin slightly, ignoring the way Jessica and Olivia were still hovering nearby, waiting, watching, searching for an opening to retake control of the conversation. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steadier this time, stronger. Jackie nodded once, then gestured toward the counter. "Then go buy it." It wasn't a command, it wasn't even encouragement, it was just a fact. A natural conclusion to a situation that shouldn't have been complicated in the first place. And yet, somehow, that simple statement unraveled something inside her, something that had been knotted up for too long. Because maybe it really was that simple. Maybe she didn't need permission. Maybe she didn't need to prove anything. She turned without another word, walking toward the register. Each step felt heavier than it should have, not because she was afraid, but because it was the first time in a long time that she wasn't shrinking herself to fit into the spaces other people left for her. She heard Jessica let out a small scoff behind her, barely above a whisper, and she knew, without looking, that Olivia had leaned in to mutter something under her breath. But for once, it didn't matter. She reached the counter, setting the dress down in front of the cashier. The woman behind the register looked from her to Jackie, recognition flickering across her face, but she said nothing about him. Instead, she smiled warmly at Maya as she scanned the tag. "Great choice," she said lightly, and whether she meant it or not, Maya decided she was going to believe her. Jackie stepped up beside her as she pulled out her wallet, his expression still unreadable, but something about his presence felt like reassurance. Not the kind that came from pity, not the kind that said "I'm here to save you," but the kind that simply said "I see you." As the cashier placed the dress carefully into a bag, Maya let out a slow breath, something shifting inside her that she couldn't quite name. Maybe this wasn't about a dress. Maybe it never had been. She turned back toward Jackie, hesitating for just a second before speaking. "Thank you." Jackie shrugged slightly, his eyes glinting with something almost amused. "For what?" Maya opened her mouth, then closed it again, because she wasn't sure how to put it into words. Not just for stepping in, not just for shutting Jessica and Olivia down, but for asking her a question no one else ever had. For not treating her like someone who needed saving, but just someone who needed to hear her own voice. She shook her head, letting a small, real smile slip through. "For nothing," she said instead, because somehow, that felt like the most honest answer. Jackie gave a small nod of approval before stepping back, hands in his pockets again, his job here apparently done. And maybe it was. Because Maya wasn't the same girl who had picked up that dress 10 minutes ago. She wasn't sure who she was yet, but for the first time, she was excited to find out. The moment Maya stepped through the grand entrance of the gala, she felt the weight of 100 eyes on her, scanning, measuring, calculating whether she belonged. The room was breathtaking, golden chandeliers hanging above tables draped in pristine white linens, soft classical music floating in the background, waiters in crisp uniforms weaving between elegantly dressed guests holding glasses of champagne. She gripped her clutch tightly, her heart pounding against her ribs, but she refused to hesitate, refused to shrink herself down the way she had so many times before. The red dress clung to her in all the right places, its fabric shimmering under the lights, and for once, she didn't feel like she was trying to disappear. She took a slow breath and stepped further inside, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. A few people turned their heads, some with polite curiosity, others with the kind of glance that made it clear they were questioning why she was here. She ignored them. She had every right to be in this room, every right to stand in the same space as them, and no one, not Jessica, not Olivia, not the whispers curling around the edges of the crowd, was going to convince her otherwise. It didn't take long before she spotted them. Jessica and Olivia stood near the bar, dressed in sleek designer gowns, their makeup flawless, their presence as effortless as ever. They weren't alone, of course. People like them never were. A small circle of equally polished guests surrounded them, laughing at something Jessica had just said, the kind of laughter that didn't need to be loud to feel exclusive. Olivia was the first to see her. Her gaze flicked to Maya, pausing for just a fraction of a second before she leaned into Jessica, whispering something under her breath. Jessica's expression didn't change at first, but then she turned her head, her eyes landing on Maya, and the moment she registered what she was seeing, her lips curled into something sharp. Maya didn't slow her steps, didn't let her face betray even a fraction of hesitation. She wasn't here for them. She wasn't here to prove anything. But as she moved deeper into the crowd, weaving through conversations and the clinking of glasses, she could feel the energy shift. Jessica and Olivia were watching her, and by extension, so was everyone else around them. The unspoken rules of this world dictated that people like Maya were meant to remain on the fringes, to be nothing more than an afterthought. But the moment she stepped into their space wearing something that demanded attention, something that refused to let them pretend she didn't exist, she became a disruption. She reached the bar just as Jessica's voice rang out, perfectly timed, perfectly loud enough to ensure that everyone in earshot would hear. "Wow, Maya, I barely recognized you," she said, tilting her head with an exaggerated smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That dress is a choice." Maya felt the pause in the conversation around her, the slight shift in posture from the people who had been mid-laugh, mid-sip, mid-sentence. This was how it always started, with a single sentence designed to put her on unstable ground, to remind her that no matter how she dressed, no matter how much effort she put in, she would always be seen as an outsider in their world. But something was different this time. She had already lived through the moment they tried to humiliate her once, had already stood in front of them while they tried to make her doubt herself, and she had walked away with her head high. She wasn't about to let them rewrite the narrative just because the setting had changed. Maya turned to Jessica, her expression calm, controlled. "I know," she said evenly, meeting her gaze without flinching. "You were so sure I wouldn't be here. That must be disappointing for you." There was a beat of silence, a barely noticeable flicker in Jessica's confident exterior. Olivia shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass, but she stayed quiet, waiting to see how this would play out. Jessica's smile didn't falter, but there was something different in the way she looked at Maya now, something calculating, something irritated. "Oh, please," she said, laughing lightly, as if Maya's words were nothing more than a silly joke. "No one said you couldn't come. We just figured you'd want to be comfortable." These events can be a lot, you know? Maya raised an eyebrow. You mean, comfortable somewhere else? Somewhere you don't have to see me? Jessica's mouth twitched, the barest sign of frustration at the way the conversation was slipping out of her control. Don't be dramatic, she said, her voice still coated in that sickly sweet politeness. I was just being considerate. Maya smiled then, slow and deliberate. You don't have to pretend, Jessica. We both know exactly what you meant when you said I didn't belong here. But here's the thing, I don't need you to be okay with it. You can keep whispering, keep making your little comments, but it won't change the fact that I'm standing right here, in the same dress you tried to convince me I had no right to wear. She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough that only Jessica and Olivia could hear. And the best part? You hate that you can't ignore me. For the first time, Jessica had nothing to say. Olivia's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to jump in, to say something to tip the power back in their favor, but she hesitated just a second too long, and that was all Maya needed. She didn't wait for them to recover, didn't give them a chance to come up with a response that would let them claw back control. She simply turned away, stepping past them, leaving them standing there with their carefully crafted confidence cracking right in front of everyone. As she walked further into the gala, she heard snippets of conversation around her, murmurs, quiet exchanges between guests who had witnessed what had just happened. Some were surprised. Some were amused. But most of all, there was something Maya had never felt in a room like this before: acknowledgement. She had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, convincing herself that if she just stayed quiet, if she just made herself small enough, maybe the world would be kind to her. But the truth was, people like Jessica and Olivia had never ignored her because she was unimportant. They had ignored her because they were afraid of what would happen if she forced them to see her. And now, standing in the center of that ballroom, head held high, wearing the dress they had tried to take from her, she realized something. They were the ones who didn't belong anymore. Maya moved through the gala without hesitation, her step steady, her shoulders back, ignoring the last remnants of Jessica and Olivia's shocked silence behind her. She didn't look back, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing whether their words had any effect because, for the first time, they didn't. The conversation was over, and she had walked away winning. It wasn't the kind of victory that needed shouting or celebration. It was quiet, simple, the kind of win that came from knowing that the moment she had once dreaded had finally happened, and she had faced it without breaking. She reached one of the long tables lined with elegant name cards, scanning for her own. The gala wasn't just a party, it was an event meant to celebrate young artists, a mix of students, professors, and well-known figures in the industry. She had been invited because of her work, because people saw something in her paintings that mattered, and as much as Jessica and Olivia wanted to act like she had no right to be here, they weren't the ones who decided. She spotted her name in the middle of the table, sandwiched between two names she didn't recognize, and slid into her seat just as the first speaker took the stage. She listened, nodding politely, occasionally glancing at the other guests around her. Some people were engaged in the speeches, others whispered quietly to each other, but no one looked at her the way Jessica and Olivia had. No one was waiting for her to slip up, to embarrass herself, to do something that would prove they had been right all along. The people at her table introduced themselves with ease, asked about her work, shared stories of their own. And slowly, as the night moved forward, she realized something she had never truly let herself believe before. Most people weren't like Jessica and Olivia. Most people didn't care whether she fit into some narrow definition of what was acceptable. They were here for the same reason she was, because they loved art, because they wanted to be surrounded by others who understood that kind of passion. The realization settled into her bones, solid and unshakable, just as the final speaker stepped onto the stage. The room quieted, the sound of glasses and whispered conversations fading as the microphone crackled to life. Maya didn't think much of it at first, just another speech, another part of the evening, until she heard the name. Tonight, we want to recognize an artist whose work has left a profound impact. Someone whose vision has challenged expectations, whose ability to translate emotion onto canvas has caught the attention of some of the most respected figures in this industry. The speaker paused, scanning the crowd, and Maya felt her breath hitch, an uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. Please join me in congratulating Maya Lee. The room erupted into applause, and for a moment, she was frozen. She had known she was invited as one of the featured artists, but she hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected to be singled out, to be called to the stage, to suddenly have every set of eyes in the room trained on her. She forced herself to move, rising from her seat, willing her legs to remain steady as she walked through the rows of tables toward the stage. The applause didn't die down, didn't falter, and as she climbed the steps, gripping the edges of her dress to keep from stumbling, she felt something shift. It wasn't fear. It wasn't panic. It was something else, something she wasn't used to. Recognition. She reached the podium, the speaker stepping aside as she faced the crowd. She could see them all, the professors who had once critiqued her work in class, the students she had sat next to in the studio, the industry professionals she had only ever seen in magazines. And just beyond them, standing near the bar, Jessica and Olivia. Their expressions were unreadable, but they were watching. They had no choice but to watch. The microphone was in front of her, the room waiting, and she realized she had to say something. She cleared her throat, her fingers gripping the podium as she forced herself to breathe. "A few days ago, I wasn't sure if I belonged here," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart pounded. "I let myself believe that I had to prove something to be worthy of this space, that I had to ask for permission to be seen." She exhaled slowly, letting her gaze drift across the room, pausing just long enough where she knew it would matter. "But I don't feel that way anymore." She didn't look at Jessica and Olivia when she said it, but she didn't have to. The words hung in the air, undeniable, impossible to ignore. There was another round of applause as she stepped away, shaking the hand of the speaker before making her way back down the steps. People nodded at her, whispered congratulations as she passed, and by the time she reached her seat again, the unease had faded. She had spent so much of her life trying not to take up space. Tonight, she had taken up more space than she ever had before, and the world hadn't ended. If anything, it had only just started to open up. The night wasn't over, but something had changed. Maya could feel it in the way people looked at her now, the subtle shift in their expressions when they passed by, the way some even stopped to offer a handshake or a quiet word of congratulations. She had walked into this gala expecting to exist on the edges, to be tolerated at best and ignored at worst, but now there was no avoiding it. She had been seen, acknowledged in a way that even she hadn't been prepared for. She could still hear the applause ringing in her ears, still feel the weight of her own words lingering in the air, and no matter what happened next, no matter how much Jessica and Olivia wanted to pretend otherwise, nothing could take that moment away from her. She stayed seated for a while, letting the hum of conversation around her settle back into place, letting the tension that had coiled so tightly inside her slowly unravel. But even as she forced herself to focus on the present, on the clinking of glasses and the soft notes of the string quartet playing in the background, she knew it wasn't over. Jessica and Olivia hadn't approached her yet, but they would. They always did. And sure enough, it didn't take long. She caught sight of them moving toward her before they spoke, their presence unmistakable even in the crowded ballroom. Jessica walked slightly ahead, her posture still perfect, her expression carefully controlled, while Olivia trailed just behind, her lips pressed into a thin line. The same people who had congratulated Maya minutes ago were still lingering nearby, their eyes flicking between her and the two girls approaching, aware that something was about to unfold but unsure if they wanted to be part of it. Jessica stopped just beside the table, one manicured hand resting lightly on the back of an empty chair. "Well," she said, her voice smooth, measured, not quite as sharp as before but still carrying that same edge. "That was unexpected." Maya didn't move. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't shrink under the weight of Jessica's gaze like she had in the past. She simply lifted her chin slightly, meeting Jessica's eyes without hesitation. "Was it?" Jessica let out a quiet breath, a laugh that wasn't really a laugh, and exchanged a glance with Olivia before looking back at Maya. "I mean, let's be honest," she continued, her tone lighter now, as if she were just making casual conversation. "You didn't really think you'd be the one getting called up there tonight, did you? I'm not saying you don't deserve it, but," she let the sentence hang, her smile just a little too tight, her meaning clear even without the words to finish it. Maya could feel the heat of Olivia's stare, the way she was waiting, watching, ready to jump in if Jessica needed her. But Maya wasn't going to give them the reaction they wanted. She wasn't going to let them drag her back into the space they had always tried to keep her in. She had spent so much time letting people like them decide how much of herself she was allowed to show, letting their words chip away at whatever confidence she had managed to build. "Not tonight. I don't need you to tell me whether or not I deserve it," Maya said, her voice steady. "I'm here because my work speaks for itself, just like everyone else in this room." Olivia scoffed, folding her arms across her chest. "Relax, Maya." Jessica was just making conversation. Maya turned to her, taking in the way she shifted slightly under the weight of her gaze, the way her fingers curled just a little too tightly around the fabric of her dress. "No, she wasn't," Maya said simply. But that's fine. I get it. You don't like that I'm here. You don't like that people are paying attention to me instead of you. You don't like that you don't get to decide how I feel about myself anymore. Jessica's smile faltered for half a second before she caught herself, straightening her shoulders. Wow, she said, shaking her head slightly. Someone's gotten a little full of herself. Maya exhaled slowly, letting the words roll off her the way she wished she had always been able to. No, she said, standing up from her seat, forcing them to meet her at eye level. I've just stopped letting people like you tell me who I am. Jessica didn't respond right away, and for the first time, Maya saw something flicker in her expression, something that almost looked like uncertainty. Olivia shifted beside her, clearly waiting for Jessica to say something, to take control of the situation again. But the confidence that had always been so effortless for her suddenly seemed harder to grasp. Maya didn't give them time to recover. She turned, stepping past them, leaving them standing there in the middle of the ballroom with no easy way to spin the conversation back in their favor. And as she walked past the clusters of guests still engaged in quiet conversation, she could feel the weight of something lifting from her chest. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. She wasn't waiting for their approval. She was done playing by their rules.